buenas tardes, saludos a
Good
todos, a
afternoon,
todas
and greetings to all of
y a
you
todos.
present.
Estamos aquí
We are
para
here
el próximo panel
for the
y
next panel.
una de las cosas que le
One
quiero
of the
pedir
things that I want to ask you
es que se pongan en mute
is
durante
to
el
please
proceso de
mute
presentaciones.
the microphone during the presentation period.
El panel va a
The
ser en
panel
inglés.
is going to be in English.
Permiso,
Sí, Alfredo.
permiso. Sí, lo que pasa es que la que está traduciendo tiene el micrófono abierto y se oye a la vez que tú estás hablando.
Ok, Wendy
La que
se
está
supone que
traduciendo tiene que poner en mute el micrófono. Porque se oyen las dos a la vez.
Wendy, ¿es simultánea la traducción?
Sí, es simultánea.
Ok, sí, va a ser entonces simultáneo. Voy a hablar entonces un poquito más lento, menos puertorriqueño y caribeño. Mi nombre es Yara González Justiniano.
My name is Yara González Justiniano.
Y
Yara, disculpa, creo
sí.
que yo no estoy viendo que hay aquí el sistema de traducción. Creo que es por eso que estamos escuchando ambos canales simultáneamente. No va, si ponen mudo, los que necesitan la traducción no la van a escuchar.
Cierto.
Exacto. Y como el panel va a ser predominantemente en inglés,
Because the panel is going to be predominantly in English.
pues para así acomodar a cada uno de las.
This way we can accommodate to everyone's needs.
Si tienen preguntas,
Should you have any questions?
Horacio es el técnico.
Horatio is the technician.
Así que ven el
Therefore,
logo de AED
you're going to see the logo that says AED.
y pues pueden hacerle cualquier tipo de pregunta.
And
Yo
you can
también-
ask any kind of questions.
Yo estoy como moderadora
I myself, I am playing the role of moderator,
y me comunico en español o en inglés.
and I can communicate either in English or in Spanish.
Sí, en los breakouts no va a haber
Yes, during
traducción,
the breakouts, there will not be an interpretation service,
pero estará con ustedes
but it will be with you,
alguno de los miembros del panel.
some of the members of the panel.
Lo que procede
The
es
next
que
thing
cada uno de nosotros
is that each one of
vamos
us
a presentarnos
is going to
comenzando
present ourselves, introduce ourselves
con Oscar García Johnson.
with Oscar Garcia Johnson.
Le sigue
After that,
Evan Hunter,
it will be Mr. Evan Hunter,
esta servidora,
myself,
y finalmente
and
Lester.
finally, Lester.
A cada uno tenemos
Each one
alrededor de 10 minutos.
of us has approximately 10 minutes to make the presentation.
Luego entonces pues
After
compartiremos
that,
un poco
we are going to share a little bit
entre nosotros
amongst ourselves.
y
And
luego pues tendremos un
after
breakout
that, we will have a breakout session
para ¿verdad? Para el grupo predominante.
for the entire group predominantly.
Así que, Oscar, please take it away.
Oscar, por favor, prosiga.
Remember everybody to introduce yourselves and
Recuerden presentarse cada uno de
you
ustedes.
want each of the folks here to know about you.
Queremos que cada persona aquí presente sepa sobre ustedes.
Bueno, es un gusto estar aquí con
It
todos
is a
ustedes,
pleasure to be
colegas.
here with all of you, my dear colleagues.
No contaba que iba a ser traducción simultánea
I was not expecting it to be a simultaneous interpretation
en,
service
en términos de que se acorta la presentación.
The presentation.
Pero por lo menos hice
But
un
at least
keynote
I
presentation
did a keynote presentation
para poder capturar algunos
in
conceptos.
order to be able to capture some main concepts.
Y esto con
And
gusto
this, with pleasure,
se los puedo compartir.
I will share this with pleasure.
Pero yo he escrito un
But
artículo
I have written an article
precisamente acerca de este
precisely
tema.
about this subject.
Así que está completamente hecho.
So it is completely done.
Está saliendo en Fuller Magazine en este mes.
It's going to be published in Fuller Magazine this month.
So déjeme,
So allow me,
the title I put
el
is Beyond
título que yo he
Latinocidio,
puesto es Beyond Latinocide,
Building Latinx Space in Theological Institutions.
Building Latino Space in Theological Institution, construyendo el espacio latino en la institución teológica.
So let me begin with my
Entonces,
story.
permítame comenzar con mi historia.
I was when I came to the seminary,
Cuando yo vine al seminario,
I was a lay leader.
Yo era un líder laico.
And I came through, with some
Yo
Latinx
vine con algún Latinx
and ministry questions into
y
seminary.
con preguntas del ministerio, y así llegué yo al seminario.
I wanted to be trained and be
Yo quería
effective,
estar capacitado, yo quería ser eficaz.
serving the Lord and serving the
Yo
people of
quería
God.
servir a Dios y servir a la gente de Dios.
Now, then I became a church planter.
Entonces, yo me hice un plataformista de
And
la
then
iglesia, y luego,
I became denominational leader.
y luego me hice el líder denominacional.
Well, that happened while I was going to
Esto pasó
PhD
mientras yo
studies.
estaba pasando mis estudios de grado doctoral.
And something interesting happened
Y algo interesante pasó.
in my education in a theological
En mi
institution in the United
educación en
States.
una institución teológica en los Estados Unidos.
My questions
Mis preguntas
began to morph into something else.
comenzaron a cambiar y a volverse algo diferente.
The premise was that
¿Sabe? La premisa era
that I will need to
que
live
yo
aside
necesitaría vivir
my
aparte,
particular and temporary questions.
dejar de una parte mis preguntas particulares y temporales.
That is the questions about my
Es decir,
Latinidad
las
and my
preguntas
ministry.
sobre mi latinidad y mi ministerio.
And instead adopt a
En
bigger
vez
and
de
more
eso,
universal question.
adoptar una pregunta mayor y una pregunta más universal.
That is the
Es decir,
questions
las preguntas
of Western Christianity.
del cristianismo occidental.
Because those questions of
Porque
Western
estas
Christianity
preguntas del cristianismo occidental
will eventually give the answer to my
eventualmente
Latino
me
Christianity.
darían la respuesta a mi cristianidad latina.
This is what I call
Esto
Latinocidio.
es lo que yo llamo el latinocidio.
I was trying to be a
Yo
Western
estaba
theologian.
tratando de ser demasiado occidental.
And regardless of my
¿Sabe
social
qué?
and epistemic location,
Independientemente de mi localización social y epistémica.
it didn't matter that I
No
was an immigrant Latino
importaba
in the
que yo
United
fuera un
States,
inmigrante latino en los Estados Unidos,
working with Latina
trabajando
transnational communities,
con nacionalidades latinas y transnacionales y comunidades,
and other people of
y
color.
con personas de color también.
So I was made
Entonces
into a successful imposter
yo me hice un impostor exitoso,
because my teaching,
porque
my
mi
preaching,
enseñanza y mi
my
doctrina,
evangelizing, my counseling,
mi evangelizar,
my
mi
healing gifts
presentación, mi
all
sanidad, es
became conduits
todas
by
se
which
volvieron conductos mediante los
my
cuales
students
mis estudiantes
were barbarically civilized.
estaban barbáricamente civilizados.
And this by virtue of my own
Y
westernization during
esto
my
por mi
educational
propio
process.
occidentalismo y en mi educación.
So Latinocidio for me
Entonces,
means
latinocidio para mí significa
that I was transforming to
que yo
someone
estaba
else,
transformándome en otra persona,
into something
en
else,
algo diferente,
a mechanism, if you
un
will,
mecanismo, si así lo quieren llamar,
by which I have become an
mediante el
expert
cual yo me había hecho un
on
perito
civilizing my own
en
people
civilizar a mi propia gente,
with a doctoral degree to prove
con
it.
un grado doctoral para comprobarlo.
I was pedagogically handicapped.
Pedagógicamente estaba
I was not able to teach my
discapacitado.
students.
Yo no podía enseñar a mis
I
estudiantes.
could only teach them the
Yo
subject
solamente
of
podía
Western
enseñarles
theology.
el tema de teología occidental.
And whatever, they
Y
can do with it,
cualquier
and as
cosa que
they
ellos
try
pudieran
to,
hacer con eso,
to apply
según
it to
trataban de
their own
aplicarlo
barbaric
a
environments.
su propio ambiente barbárico.
You see, the imposter
Se
syndrome
fijan,
for me
el síndrome de impostor para mí
was not so much about not
no
feeling
era
enough and
tanto
adequate
de no
within
sentirse
Western Christian
adecuado
Academy.
o bastante con una academia occidental cristiana.
Instead, it was
En lugar de eso,
Latinocidio.
latinocidio.
How the
¿Cómo?
theological formation process
El proceso de formación
converted
teológica
me
me convirtió
into a colonial subject,
en un sujeto colonial,
an expert in everything
un perito en todo,
that my own people,
que mi propia gente,
my vocation,
mi vocación
and my ministry
y mi ministerio
was not.
no lo era.
when I realized that,
Cuando yo me di cuenta de eso,
I would say a little late in the
bueno, un
journey,
poquito tarde durante mi
I had to
jornada,
take a full process of
tuve
decolonization
que tomar el proceso total de
of my own self,
descolonización de mi propio ser,
my pedagogical positionality,
mi posición pedagógica,
my theological method,
mi método
and my
teológico
praxis of being in the
y
public
mi
space
praxis de estar en el espacio público
as a,
¿Cómo?
as a Christian theologian. So
como un teólogo cristiano.
let's go to the presentation here.
Entonces, vamos de aquí a la presentación.
You know, this is the story, and
Miren,
Latinocidio
esta es la historia y latinocidio lo que es,
has to do with the extermination of
tiene que
cultural
ver
worth
con el exterminio del valor
and
cultural
distinctive Latinx
y
contribution
las contribuciones distintivas
for the
de
sake of a
latino,
common and universal
por
institutional culture and mission.
una misión común y universal de la institución cultural.
And my story by no means is
Mi
unique.
anécdota no es singular,
It's so common.
es tan común.
You got people I have people in
Hay
this room
personas en
that they
este
can speak even
cuarto,
better to
en
what I'm
esta
talking
sala,
about.
que pueden aún hablar mejor de este tema de lo que
But
puedo
since the
hacerlo yo.
70s, you know,
Pero
since the
desde la
70s,
década de los 70,
Latina and Latino theologians have
los
noticed
teólogos latinos y latinas
Latinocidal
notado
forces present in Western
fuerzas
theological
latinocidas
education
presentes en la educación occidental teológica
and its global connections.
y sus conexiones globales.
For example, Orlando
Por
Costas,
ejemplo,
many of you,
Orlando
he said,
Costas,
with
él
few
dijo,
exceptions, the
con
missiological
pocas
literature
excepción, la
of the North still
literatura
oriented to the
misiológica del
questions
norte todavía está
before
orientada a
the
las
church
preguntas
there,
antes
north,
de la iglesia
rather
ahí
than
en el
here,
norte,
south.
antes que aquí en el sur.
So it's clearly a
Entonces,
critique to Western
claramente es una
education
crítica a la
for
educación
somebody who
occidental
has a
para
continental
una
lifestyle.
persona que tiene un estilo de vida continental.
Then another question that is a
Entonces, otra
stunning question for
pregunta,
me.
que es una pregunta que me resulta
Many have asked those
impactante.
questions too after
Muchos han
him
hecho
or with
esa
him.
pregunta con él y después
How
de él,
is it
inclusive.
that
¿Cómo es
Christianity
que
in Latin America has
el
had
cristianismo en
a
América
much longer
Latina ha tenido
history
una historia mucho más
than its
larga
Anglo-Saxon
que su
counterpart?
contraparte anglosajona?
And yet Latin
Sin
America
embargo,
has
América
produced so
Latina
very few
ha
theologians
producido
and
tan
contributed so
pocos
little to the mission
teólogos
and
y
the
ha
universal
contribuido
church.
tan poquito a la misión de la Iglesia Universal.
So this is clearly a
Entonces,
critique, more a
claramente esto
sense
es
of,
una
oh, we
crítica,
don't value
una
ourselves.
idea
This
de
is
que
a
no nos
critique,
valoramos nosotros
that there
mismos,
are
una crítica
elements
de que hay elementos
preventing
que
this
impiden
population
que esta población
from embracing the fullness of the
pueda
potential.
abarcar la totalidad de la extinción.
So
Entonces,
that in a way speaks to
eso de una
some of
manera
us called the colonial wound,
nos habla a lo que nosotros le llamamos la herida colonial,
which is the result of a
lo cual es el
sophisticated and overwhelming web.
resultado.
¿Desde dónde voy a entrar? ¿Desde el mismo correo?
Inaugurated in 1492 with the conquest and perfected, through multiple social political experiments during the triangulation of coloniality, modernity, and Occidentalism. And we can speak of 4 Latinocidios. I'm just putting this here for conversation. The first Latinocidio, it's, in the colonial time, conversion by colonial economy and civilizing Christianity. And all these are participated in theological education since multiple theologians. The second Latinocidio, conversion by US Americanism in the 1900s, introduction to Protestantism. The third Latinocidio is conversion by the doctrine of development in the 1930s and the 1960s. And we can speak of a fourth Latinocidio by market capitalism in the 1970s and the 200s and the 20s. We're right now a little bit in the social, network capitalism, a little different. So these are and all these are unfortunately we have participated in the process of theological education. But I just want to throw some numbers real quick. ATS, just to say that this is not a 500-year long ago, it is a 500-year today problem. 7 to 6% of Hispanics are enrolled are enrolled in ATS schools, which is below the African Americans and the Asian population, just above of Native Americans. So we have the lowest registered enrollment. So there seems to be a problem of attraction and retention in ATS schools for Latinas. Here is a very painful number. Latina woman full professors, Out of 1,300 full professors in ATS school, 0.5% are Latinas. This is painful. I don't know how you feel, but this is painful. Anyway, I'm just saying that we have issues in theological schools. And what I see, because I'm running here, that I see that there's two attempts to deal with Latinocideo in theological institutions of the West. On the right, we have a monocultural lordship. I mean, there is a kind of a far right approach to say, you come with us, we're going to help you, but it's going to be our way or the highway. And then on the left, we have what is called liberal multiculturalism, which kind of some schools show that, you know, they hired faculty, they populate, you know, the surroundings with multicultural faces and bodies, but yet at the very core, still white male, or it could be female white, you know, structures that in a way carries the power and privilege. So monocultural lords, multicultural saviors. So this is my way to deal with it. I think that there is a way forward, but that will just have to turn around the whole theological school project in the United States and in its connections. And I would begin to say with some decolonist friends, let us imagine a formation process on campus where we can come to unlearn. Forget about learning. We have to begin to unlearn. And in that place, things have to change for that unlearning to happen. Number one, we need to be realistic and cope with the demographics by servicing we the people of now, not we the people of the past, we the people of the elite. We have to embrace brown bodies and what they bring with them, radical diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that have to permeate the whole institution. 3, welcome and work with Latina critics within and connected to the institution. Give them voice, knowledge, tools to deconstruct, reform, and rebuild. If we don't do that, nothing's going to happen. 4, decolonize curricula, operations, leadership, structures, policy, marketing, HR, hiring and retention. And 5, reward cultural, ethnic, gender, epistemic difference. If that doesn't happen, just to begin with, we'll have Latinocideo today. I'll leave there.
Thank you, Oscar. Such great food for thought. I appreciate you rushing, and I appreciate everybody's adjustment with the things happen as we're continuing to learn, regardless of it being a year on Zoom. Can everybody who needs the Spanish translation, todos los que necesitan la traducción en español, la pueden escuchar? I just want to make sure that people who are needing the Spanish translation can hear it.
No.
Horacio, para que sepa que no están, sé que mencionaste que Wendy estaba en su propio canal. Si puedes, por favor, darnos las instrucciones de cómo acceder a eso. Can you please guide us to, for folks who need instructions on how to hear the Spanish translation?
Estoy consultando, tan pronto lo tenga disponible,
Okay,
aviso.
Mm-hmm.
I'm consulting here with other people. Once I get the information, I will let you know. Sorry.
¿Me pueden escuchar?
Maybe Grace has to be unmuted. Wendy has to be unmuted.
Sí, ahora, Wendy.
Wendy is unmuted.
Ahora escuchamos.
Okay, excelente. Gracias. Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate your patience.
Gracias por su paciencia.
Evan?
Great. Well, good afternoon. My name is Evan Hunter, and I serve with an organization called Scholar Leaders International. And we work with Bible schools and seminaries around the world. And so my privilege of ministry is engaging with quite a number of schools as they continue to develop and grow. And so some of the aspects that Oscar just shared about that deep need for the development of Latino and Hispanic theologians resonates deeply with me as we seek to work with schools to strengthen them across Latin America, South and Central America, and other Spanish-speaking parts of the world, as well as across Africa and Asia and other components as well. And so a deep desire to see the growth of theology, theological reflection, and the preparation of servants for the church and society to continue to increase. And that's a portion of our mission. With regard to the idea of theological education in a time of change, this is certainly one of those moments, and it has been for quite some time, but it's a time of change that has been accelerated here over the last 18 months with the onset of the COVID pandemic. And one of the interesting things is it provides an interesting opportunity for some of the deconstruction. A year ago, I wrote an article that was published in the Insights Journal for Global Theological Education. I'll put the website for that journal in the chat if you're interested in looking at that or other articles related to theological education globally, as well as some related specifically to the pandemic. But in it, one of the factors was, in a very unique way, the pandemic created a universal challenge for theological education. For probably the first time, certainly in my lifetime, all schools everywhere were facing a common set of challenges. They weren't regionalized based on a disaster. They weren't regionalized based on a particular economic downturn or social or political challenge. They were universal, and all schools everywhere were feeling that impact. About that same time, Andy Crouch and others wrote an article in Praxis speculating that crises can come in three forms, and they used a meteorological metaphor of there are storms which you weather very quickly. There are seasons, say a winter, that you kind of suffer through, but they will be gone in a matter of weeks or months. And then there are things that are much more lasting, an ice age. And it's not just how long they last, but it's the change they leave on the landscape when they're done. And it seems at this point that we definitely have seen that this has been a ice age kind of impact, that the landscape of theological education and education in general has been impacted deeply. And so there's been a lot of creativity and innovation in response to that. Certainly in the immediate, schools were dealing with humanitarian crisis. They were dealing with just the ability to reach students. Online, there were a lot of shifts that were happening. But I think one of the next questions for us is not just what are we doing, but as theological education, what are we learning? And so as educators, I think that there's opportunity to draw from two aspects. One is organizational development, and Peter Senge's idea of a learning organization. That is an organization characterized by an aspiration for learning, of seeking to solve problems together and to move back and forth between thinking and action, or action and reflection as another term of that. And how are we as educational institutions so often focused on teaching, learning during this time? And then secondly, to draw from adult learning theory, and particularly Mesereau's idea of transformative learning, that this idea that there are moments in life when a disorienting dilemma creates a significant amount of disequilibrium. And certainly this has been one of those moments. Everything that we sort of knew about how education functions suddenly became challenged. The presence of students became challenged. The delivery modes of education had to shift in a matter of days and weeks. The role of faculty members changed at many institutions. The idea of what it meant to teach changed for many of those faculty members. The models of education, including how do we sustain it, how do we fund it, suddenly became challenged as we saw schools not only lose tuition, but also learn access to donors, and particularly in the world where I work, overseas in the majority world, access to both local contributions as economies were placed on hold during quarantines and lockdowns, as well as foreign donors as travel stopped globally. And then for those schools that had found ways to generate additional income, those projects also came to a screeching halt as the economies froze. So schools that had conference centers or hotels or had other ways of generating revenue, all three of those, tuition, donations, third stream income projects, came to a halt in the same moment. And so in the idea of challenging our frameworks and assumptions, COVID brought that to a head in a very universal reality. And so some of the things that had been possible were no longer possible. And it requires us to ask questions of our assumptions. As Oscar said, there's a level of unlearning and deconstruction that gets to happen organizationally, not just theologically or personally, but also as an institution. What does it mean to be the institution during this time? And as we move through it, and I say move through it because as a friend in Colombia reminded me last week, as some places such as North America feel like they're coming out of COVID, she was quick to say, we are not coming out of it. We are very much in the middle of it. And so as we move through it, what are we learning? How are we turning that personal critical reflection inward to say, what are we learning at this time? I think of that same leader of a school in Colombia who said, because of our online learning, we've gained a new insight into the lives and homes of our students as their cameras show us what's going on in the background behind them, of mothers who are at sewing machines while students are taking classes, as children run through the frame, as these things happen that bring us closer together, closer to the regular life of what's happening. Or a school in Lebanon, which has decided to completely change their approach to education and do away with the residential model, which brought students from across the Middle East region to Beirut, and rather move to an online and modular supported capacity. And in doing so, they recognize that it completely changes the profile of their students. And what are they learning as they do that? What are they learning about their calling and their mission? What are we learning about how we sustain education when things have been upended and may not go back to normal? And so in closing, I think as we ask the questions about what are we learning, one of the first questions we want to ask, and it's the first question of transformative learning, is what assumptions have been challenged by the pandemic? What does it mean to form students when students aren't in proximity to us? What does it mean to be a faculty, a community of scholars, when we aren't in proximity to one another? How do we go about those callings of forming students for Christian service, of engaging with one another in theological reflection when our normal frameworks have been upended? And as we move towards a different moment in that, what do we take forward from that? What are we learning about how we engage the church as well as the academy as we move through it? And how do we make sense of the new realities? Do we simply embrace them and envelop them and create hybrid models everywhere? Do we go back to some of the strengths that are there that can't be done over the Zoom screen? What are the assumptions and how have they been challenged? And then secondly, what do we learn from our experience? Everybody got a crash course in experience. What do we take from that? And third, as institutions, and finally, how do we create reflective space so that we can have the necessary dialogue and interaction so that we can come out of this with a sense of learning, not just a sense of doing new things because of it? I'll wrap it there.
Thank you, Evan. Right on time. Appreciate that. We're getting into it. So as I mentioned before, my name is Yara Gonzalez Justiniano. I am originally from Puerto Rico, and I've had experience in different theological backgrounds, such as the Seminario de Puerto Rico, el Seminario Evangélico de Puerto Rico, as also have had the privilege of interacting with several theological institutions outside of the US, specifically in Latin America. I'm currently visiting assistant professor at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, and will be starting in the fall at Vanderbilt Divinity School. So I'm in the process of growth and transition. But my area is practical theology. So I focus on practices and what do practices tell us about our theologies, our beliefs, and about who we are. So because the Latino-Hispanic experience is endemic to the US, I will focus on theological education here, but make some references to Latin America, because as much as we want to compartmentalize and categorize, eventually, I say that what academics do is that they just organize, I want to say chaos, but lo enredado, ¿verdad? Lo que está ya weaved together. So among these seminaries that I've been able to interact with, I've been to the Seminario Matanza, Cuba twice. And in one of those visits, one of my mentors asked if I could teach there. And I immediately said yes, and then quickly paused to say, I cannot assume that I can teach here. My entire theological education has been, for the most part, in the US. And I am sorry to disappoint you, but white theology is not universal. I have a very good relationship with this mentor, so I did say this more colloquially, to say the least. But power organizes people in boxes and categories. So though I do not actively participate in the debate of Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, to name one collective ethnicity, I do understand it. And it is important as it is to gather in the struggle, as important as it is to gather in the struggle and find a common ground. The consensus on culture, practice, and even history gives us a scope of approaches and theologies that can be global, but not universal, meaning that it is not homogeneous. Victor Westell in After Heresy mocks the naivete of early 16th century missionaries' notion that evangelism in the Americas was a homogeneous success, that it came from top down and everybody was equally Christian. He argued that the alleged purity of the Christian doctrine and theology had been understood, assimilated, integrated, and replicated at their image and likeness. Su imagen y semejanza. Así que, as a practical theologian, I understand that our theologies are not only rooted in our practices, but also in our stories. And that shapes our artistry around meaning making. So I come from an understanding that to achieve union in a movement does not mean that one needs to be the same. And I think that part of this is also because we come from such a strong, Christianity itself comes from such a strong tradition of evangelizing, of having the message and sharing it to others. There's a lot of dynamics there that need to be questioned and how this works, but also how this plays to the role of colonialism, to the role of paternalism. So Christian theology in the Americas is shaped by stories and practices of conquest that predicate assimilation to gain salvation. But it's also shaped by the context of the histories of place and ancestry. So in your personal experience, this might look seamless because we, in the privacy of our chosen circles, are able to contextualize according to our surroundings. One might even think that what I believe is how everyone believes or how everyone should believe or should be. So the practice of centering ourselves in the narrative is a practice of conquest tied to colonial and patriarchal ideologies. So as the prompt of this session talks about how these things that are weaved are also weaved around colonialism, and the word decolonial for me is a very strong word because it questions our ways of being in a way that is very uncomfortable and daring. But for me as a theologian, as a practical theologian, I believe that the work of decolonizing, the work of unrooting and separating and exorcizar, right? Like expiating these things is also part of salvation, is part of our work in sharing the good news. So what makes it global is one question, but my question to this particular topic is, who makes it global? And there's a difference between the globalization of theological thought and the globalization of theological resources. So many of our texts that are used in either Latin American seminaries in Puerto Rico and Cuba and in the United States, or even the Spanish programs in theological institutions here, are translated works from white European authors, mostly predominantly male. And as Oscar, you saw the percentages, 0.5 full Latina professors. And that says a lot also, not just in terms of who is teaching, but who is writing, who is producing, who is giving these resources not only to our churches, but to our communities, to our families, like who has access to these things. So the globalization of theological thought, at least in Protestant Christian tradition, means that there is a demand for translated work, but not a production of texts that were either written in Spanish or written for Latino Hispanic audience. So it's not a problem of translation. It's not a problem of what language this is accessible. It's a problem of authority and knowing, and who gets to impart the knowledge, and then we translate that to Spanish, to Portuguese, to papiamento, to the minoritized voices, but it still comes from the center. It still comes from el ombligo, the belly button. So there's a difference between multiple exchanges between theological contributions regarded with authority and respect versus the exchange from the center to the periphery. And what it does is then enter us into that debate of whose thought and theology gets shared and globalized. So though I can think about numerous authors, I can also then think about songs, preachers, and congregations that function in this way, that are just a translation of what it is done. It's a translation of other ways of being, a translation of a song, a translation of a sermon, a translation of a practice. The way that we do ministry, the way that like the books that we purchase or the workshops that we go to that are based on how Anglo congregations do ministry. So thinking of this, I have, and I would ask also Evan to type the questions that he had at the end in the chat box so people can have them. But I also have some questions for you. And these questions are not to disregard anyone's faith nor destroy anyone's faith cord, but to bring to light practices that will help us demystify theologies and learning that limit the revelation of God's greatness. So I invite you to think about your favorite hymn, your favorite corito. Like if you have a notebook or a paper, pen, write it down. What's the corito, the hymn that just like connects you, like la línea directa to the divine? Think about your favorite passage or biblical story and how you interpret it. Like, what's your favorite passage and how do you interpret it? And then who are the voices of authority in your tradition? Question why. So your favorite hymn, favorite passage, how do you interpret it? Who are the voices of authority in your tradition, in your church, in your community? Why are they the voice of authority? And then this is something that I hope that we get to discuss together going forward. But these questions also interrogate, why are these the things that resonate with our spirit, that resonate with our critical thinking, with our spiritual thinking? Because one of the risks of universalizing theological education, as well as any other discipline, is the stubbornness around any other types of knowings and approaches that stump our growth and critical spiritual thinking. Thank you. Lester, when you're ready.
Thank you. My name is Lester Ruiz. I serve the Association of Theological Schools that was referred to earlier as Director of Accreditation and Global Engagement. I'm originally from the Philippines. Came to the US to study with the hope of going back to the Philippines, but stayed, which is kind of part of experience of many Filipinos who see the United States actually as the colonial motherland. And so in order to be educated, you go to and go back and to be respected in the colonies, you have to be educated in the centers of power. And that was part of the tradition out of which I was formed. And probably part of the reason why I refused to go back. In any case, ATS, for those of you who don't know, is an association of about 270 accredited graduate theological schools in the United States and Canada. Its mission, primary mission, is to assist theological schools in the preparation of persons for ministry in their constituencies. The DNA of ATS and its history is it was basically a white Anglo institution back in the 1930s, but eventually committed itself to a large commitment to diversity. And so currently the schools are quite diverse in terms of ecclesial membership. But unfortunately, the demographics of theological schools, accredited graduate schools, as some have already indicated, does not necessarily reflect the demographics of North America. And so already Oscar has mentioned about that, for example, faculty in many of the ATS theological schools does not match are still primarily white, male, but because it does not match the demographics, so essentially, as one example, you think of theological education in the United States as still a particular quote unquote tradition, particular group of people educating people who are not like them into who they probably want them to be. And there lies the problem, and the kinds of conversations and issues that have been raised by my colleagues already are, I think, very important, and I underscore them as part of the challenge of theological education, especially in the context of global engagement. I wanted to just, when Fernando Cascante invited me to participate in this conversation, he specifically asked me to share with you what are some of the ways in which possible collaboration could happen in a deeply fractured society, in a deeply divided society, in a theological education that is not representative of the populations of this particular part of the world. So let me do that in very briefly and then open this conversation, because I must admit, I feel a little bit uncomfortable being here in the midst of a conversation where ATS, which holds to some extent the power of accreditation, does not always have a good record in terms of ensuring that theological education is widely, not only widely dispersed, but also representative in what good theological education ought to be, which is what colleagues like my colleagues have already spoken about. Attention to particular local spaces, not as the expression of something that you might want to, you might need to globalize, but are by themselves already constitutive of what global engagement and global awareness is about. My own understanding of global engagement or global awareness is something like this. Global signifies those processes of differentiation and formation that maintains a crucial reference to the world's horizon as a space of human relations, of meaning held in common, of signification or of possible signification. So it's not so much content, it seems to me, but actually space. And ATS happily is committed to kind of trying to, in its own context, try to articulate or create space to allow for and to encourage theological education to be as full and robust as it can be. ATS has a relationship with IF, for example, where it has created a process with IF that would allow graduates from Bible schools that are part of IF, for example, who may not have the quote-unquote proper credentials for graduate theological education to be certified, and at that point of certification then to allow, or not allow, to ensure that then these people who are qualified then may be admitted to schools like accredited graduate schools. Those who do not have BAs, Bachelor of Arts, for example, there has been a mechanism that was created both by IF and by ATS to ensure that there might be that kind of access to theological education. But the difficulty in all of that, of course, is the question of what kind of theological education is being offered. And that is why it is important to listen to the voices and ensure that these voices are not only heard, but represented, the ones that have been expressed here. So let me default to part of the task of ATS in this process. Its own contribution is to ensure for itself that it listens very carefully to what is happening in the world. This is part of its commitment to global awareness and engagement. We have learned, for example, the importance of connection building, not just among the schools, but among different constituencies, effective communications, collegial collaboration, local, regional, global, and creative flexibility. These are parts of the in ATS. If you look at if you go to our website, if you talk to folks in ATS, you will see that there is a real commitment and a desire to ensure that the windows are open, the doors are open to a different kind of theological education that is also accredited in the future. Let me conclude with identifying 4 or 5 areas where there is space in which one might get involved in a conversation in the context of ATS, if that is part of what one might want to do. One very important priority is the understanding of effective global partnerships and engagement within and without North America. That's one one principle that to which ATS is committed. A second is cultivating scholarly and new scholarly and programmatic trade routes. And by that trade routes, we mean that it is not education, content, theology does not only it's not only transferred from the global north to the global south, but that there are also content, expertise, personnel also are cultivated from the global south to the global south, but also global south to the global north. There is that commitment as well. And then there is this commitment to contributing to a pan-Christian conversation on theological education. What does theological education mean today, given the diversity, plurality of the world, given the challenges that are arising, that have arisen, that have already been spoken about? And then finally, there is that area of education, commitment to educational and degree programs of study, accreditation, and quality assurance. ATS is still quite interested and committed to ensuring that that good theological education needs to be acknowledged wherever it is and whatever credentials there are. And so it is using its access to accreditation and some of the important I won't call it power, but influence in relation to what is considered quality education, to ensure that those that have been historically excluded may in fact not only be included, but may transform the very theological education that we have, the dominant theological education that we have in North America at this point in time, which is not necessarily what it is that needs to be the kind of theological education for the future. I think I'll end there.
Thank you, Lester. So now I just want to invite the panelists to, in the same order that we all presented, if there's anything that we want to remark, comment on, engage with that the other panelists have mentioned previously. And then also after that, then I'll give everybody instructions on how we're gonna divide our time for discussions, but just brief remarks to have a little conversations amongst ourselves. Oscar?
Thank you, colleagues. Great job and highly educational for me. Just kind of to have some interaction when you, Evan, were citing on the Ice Age, metaphor. I was remembering a former, philosopher and historian, Karl Hasper, who spoke about axial age, which I think it's pretty much the same, and how different axial ages have created a climatic transformation. And so I think that Crouch and Hasper are in the same. I hope Crouch cited Hasper in doing that. I haven't read that, but I think there's a lot of commonality. And indeed, there is the point that we are in that global, global moment. And let me link that with another element that was, I think it was being elaborated by Lester in terms of, and I like the word global engagement. And I've used the word global engagement also with other elements, but I think this is a time when we need to move in a global exchange and sort of a global insurrection with the normative forces that want to keep everything monocultural, monologic, monopolic. And I think we're seeing that. And in that transformation and that global engagement, global awareness, and global insurrection, there is, I will say that the ranks of the subjects making decisions is changing. So the more important is not the what, not even the when, but is the who and the where. I mean, who are the ones who ought to be the agents of those transformation? And I think in that sense, I think you alluded to that in the Lester, when you spoke of ATS attention to the exchange that is happening, not just north to south, but south to south, east to west, and all these are construct, because what we call West is really a construct. I mean, we're talking about 6 countries pretty much that has the power and the capital. And what about the other countries, right, of the West, so to speak, so in the history. So we've always, but the who and the where is important. Where is theological education happens, and to go back now to Evans, where are those questions being addressed? You see the places, and again, I try to connect here to Jara too, where you say the bodies and places are important. There is a geopolitics and geography of knowledge that we need to really put attention to, because we may have the right questions in the wrong places. And that has been part of the whole issue. And by that I mean that we can have the right question, because even having the right question is a way to own knowledge and to say to other communities that you don't own knowledge like we do own knowledge. Remember that imperial campaigns, Bonaparte went to Egypt, and the first thing he did is to learn culture, to own culture, and then launch pretty much the full domination. So there is a knowledge and power issue here that unfortunately we have to deal with. I'm not saying that all missiological efforts have been that way, but just by not putting attention to that, you can be part of it. And this is the time when global awareness, global, I would say engagement, and global insurrection may play a good part, because the who, the where, now the how are we going to now reimagine the formation institution for Christian imagination? How are we going to, what methods are we going to use, and what knowledge is going to count? That is important. And in all the studies, I think epistemology, I mean, cognitive approaches are important. I mean, how can we simply accept blank that that there was no knowledge of God in the ancestral communities, that pretty much Europe brought God into the Americas, for instance, or Africa, and that God was not active, and if he was active, nobody knew about it. I mean, that is really a very precarious way of seeing things. So we need really a lot of theological generosity in whatever we do, and where we can see God instead of Satan and ignorance in the other. So once we change that pair of eyes, that we begin to see how God is being already through history and through people embedded in multiple forms of knowledge. And we as Christians contribute to part of it, but not to the whole thing. That exchange then in a pan-Christian, and I would say an interreligious dialogue, can happen. I think we're in that moment, and that's part of the global insurrection that I'm talking about. And so we need the language, we need a training, we need a commitment to even engage and even to be in those places of exchange. That's the way I see it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Evan, do you want to respond?
Yeah, just off the bat completely resonate with some of those statements, and by all three of the other panelists. There is so much about our mission and my mission within our organization that I resonate deeply with when it comes to recentering some of the voices in our theological discourse. And Oscar, I love your phrase of sort of this how do we create this sort of insurrection, this global insurrection? I was probably going to use a more a less disruptive term, which I think reflects my own personal background. Who I am on this panel is very obvious to me. I've shared with some people in the past, my name itself. There was one of the most prolific crime authors in the United States chose the pen name Evan Hunter. His name was Salvatore Lombino, very Italian. And during the late 40s and 50s, when he became a novelist, he chose the waspiest name he could think of for his pen name, and that was Evan Hunter. So it's an interesting dynamic for me at times of kind of my heritage and background. And yet, this idea of how do we change that? How do we create, Lester, to use your language, the trade routes, and redefine those, and redefine the directions of exchange, and see that there is this level of insurrection, there is this level of turning things over in new ways. And I think crisis is one of those moments where more of that happens. One of the ideas that I'm struck by is there was a book about 9 or 10 years ago called Reverse Innovation. And it was the idea that some of the most innovative ideas come from the periphery, because those in the center have certain assumptions. One is that everything must be iterative and continue to build on what has been. And so when we go to the periphery and people question all of those assumptions, new ideas come. And I think for theological education, we're at a moment, and we've been building toward it for a long time, that requires some of that innovation, requires some of that disruption, requires perhaps some of the insurrection, to use your word, Oscar, of flipping that. And how do we find those disruptive moments? And that crisis becomes opportunity because everybody has to question some of the assumptions, because what has been isn't just working the way it has. And I think that in this moment, we've seen some of that, and that inherited models aren't the only way to do things. And how do we move beyond that inherited model and incorporate new ideas, incorporate new learning, and shift things in a positive way and for the better? And I think that, so I definitely resonate with that. Mm-hmm. And I love that phrase too, theological engineering and imagination there, Grace. Thank you. And to do it in ways that both have that theological reflection as well as that practice. And I think I love that, Yara, where you were talking about, our songs, our preaching, all of those things. How do we make sure that it's not just something that's getting translated from the middle to the periphery, but actually generative? And I think that that's one of the ideas too of being a learning organization, is generative knowledge is a part of true learning, not just sort of mastering content, but becoming truly a part of the generative process of creating new things and new ideas. And so I just want to amplify that and find ways to amplify those voices as well that are doing these new things, so that they can become not only conversant, but also a trade route, one of these pathways of exchange, so that others can hear and learn, and that it doesn't also have to be mediated back through the center, but that it can move multi-directionally around the outsides, across the middle, in a variety of exchange. And I think that's one of the critical pieces for our current moment, and for the future and survival of this enterprise that we call theological education.
Thank you, Evan. Yeah, I think that a lot of what is, at least this pandemic, and for the questions that you were asking, Evan, how will we change? Not just what we need to do or who do we need to listen to, but what will we change? A lot, we've been able to separate what's important from that which is constructed to just be either unimportant or inútil, unuseful. Things that are just, why do we do this way? It just makes no sense. Why are we suffering through this? There's already enough suffering in the world. We don't need to add it and make it. So how do we free ourselves from this? Lester, and if you have any response, and then I want us to divide ourselves in groups.
Yes, I just wanted to highlight or identify some of the things that I am hearing and I'm learning from my colleagues here at this point, from us, from you. And one of the things is this metaphor of and reality of the pandemic. I think that this needs to be. There are multiple pandemics, not just the COVID-19. I mean, colonialism for me is a pandemic, fits the definition of, for example, of pandemic, and so others, violence, for example. So there is an opportunity to expand the understanding of these multiple pandemics, I think, as a metaphor for understanding what it is, how it is that where we are this point in time. The other thing I wanted to say is, if these are the thing that partly concerns me is, can we identify what I'll just call strategies of survival, or strategies that will help us to and help peoples to outlive these multiple pandemics. Attention to brown bodies, Black bodies, attention to the ecological body. For example, these are sort of insurrection even. But I think one of the challenges that I hope we can talk about, and I'll end here, is how do we help each other to outlive the pandemics that not only confront but are widespread in the world today.
Thank you, Lester. So now I'm going to open up 4 breakout rooms. I'm hoping that at least like 8 to 10 people in each room, and you can see the name of the room being Spanish discussion or English discussion, depending on your preferred language, and that would make it easier because we're not going to have a translator. So we're going to have about 10 minutes. About 10 minutes to discuss what have you gathered, any let me just look at the questions very quickly. What topics or ideas were outstanding to you? What questions did you have or ideas that you have? And what suggestions can you offer? If you can't be part of the group, you can also, if you have to leave, you can put that in the chat. So to share it with the group. And, but if you have other questions aside from these, also I encourage you to put them on the chat, and just for us to have an idea as a collective to see what your thoughts are. So I just opened the rooms and you can choose which room to go to. Yeah, so if you go down where it says breakout room, you'll see 4 rooms. There you go. And then kind of make a balance as you are able. One of the panelists is going to be in one of your rooms. So we get to, at least for a little bit, interact with each other.
So Evan, you might be interested, maybe you know, maybe you don't, but you might be interested that that piece by Crouch,
yes,
has been kind of like formative for at least ATS staff in the conversations on learning, being everybody equalized in terms of the what we're facing and all of that. It's when you were talking, I felt, wow, I see that it's all over. So thought I'd mention that.
Yeah. Appreciate that. My one hesitancy in mentioning it in most of my context is things like winter and ice age seem very far from global south climate realities. But I live in Minnesota, so we experience them all the time. So it hits very home for me.
Yeah.
We did a translation of that article that Andy Crouch wrote. I worked at Biola and worked with the Praxis group that created that article, but we contextualized it with a group of young people in Cuba. And we utilized the storms of the hurricane for an understanding that was more, the more concrete to their context, right? So you got to find ways to make it real.
So you did it. You said you translated it actually.
Yeah, we translated it into Spanish. That whole entire.
Is that available?
Yeah, it's available. I'll look for it and see if I can put it in the chat.
Yeah, that would be, I think, worth reading. I would find it very helpful reading.
I have written, he escrito varias de estas cosas que hoy hablé, y de hecho hay una nueva serie en CLIE que se llama Teología del Nuevo Mundo, que está saliendo y que bueno, está siendo promocionada, y de hecho esto es una serie como de 7 libros en castellano, precisamente por lo que hemos hablado. Y entonces ahí van a poder ver ustedes todas estas visiones, inclusive de educación teológica, del quehacer de la teología desde el nuevo mundo, un nuevo mundo que primero se nos impartió como una idea y después nosotros realmente hemos creado un nuevo mundo. Eso está ahí disponible para que sepan.
Bueno, before quienes se gusten quedar, but like whoever wants to stay, I just wanted to close this up. I know some folks have needed to leave. Sé que algunos ya han tenido que irse, así que no sientan que se tienen que quedar, pero si quieren intercambiar contactos, if you want to exchange numbers, emails, information, please do so. But I just wanted to officially conclude our time together. Solamente quería concluir nuestro tiempo juntos y juntas por si, ¿verdad? Por si acaso alguien tiene que irse.
Gracias.
De mi parte espero por si Oscar puede conseguir la presentación en español.
Bueno, no está la presentación en español, está en inglés, pero como te digo, les acabo de poner un anuncio de la nueva serie que viene, donde está eso, pero agrandado. La presentación en inglés la acabo de poner, se las puedo poner de nuevo. If you want the presentation in English, I think I did put it, let me put it again, in the chat. Aquí se las estoy poniendo en el chat lo que dije hoy, pero en forma de un artículo. Yo les di muy rápido todo. So this is the full article. El artículo completo que está ahí lo tienen. Y ha sido un gusto, colegas.
Gracias, doctor. Es una bendición saludarle. Un abrazo.
Bueno, chao.
Gracias a todos. Y bueno, continuamos en las siguientes conferencias.
Dr. Lester, I just posted it. It took me a while to find it, so you could see there.
Okay, thank you.
Hasta luego. Doña Yara.
Gonzalo.
¿Cómo estás?
Bien, bien, gracias a Dios.
Saludos a los que quedan, llegué tarde.
Amén.
Ha sido un día pesado, pero cogí ahí la última agüita. ¿Falta algo más o se acabó?
No, ya aquí terminamos.
Ahí se acabó. Bueno, cogí que fuese un aguacerito. Bueno, saludos desde Puerto Rico a todos y todas.